In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, glory be to Jesus Christ. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. The gospel reading today is a very important one to help us understand so many things, but especially to understand the reality of what it means to be in torment. I remember, and I may have shared this with you before, when I was a kid, and somebody was digging a hole, the utilities were digging a hole in the ground to fix a pipe. The ground started getting clay and red. And my first thought as a kid, oh, they're getting close to hell. And sometimes we have these notions of hell that are very childlike in us still. You know, the devil with the pitchfork, the guy in the red suit, and you have Halloween coming up, and this glorification of evil, which in my mind is pretty serious and unfortunate. But I think they all miss the point about what hell is. It is a place of torment, but I often believe this is not a place that an angry God sent us to for being bad. There's something about this gospel reading today that provides insight into that. And I'm going to read this. So this is the rich man. And notice, the rich man does not have a name. He's not known before God with a name. It's Lazarus that is named in this story. And so the rich man, he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy upon me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that you in your lifetime received good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you. Well, that's a lot of stuff going on there. A lot of things are being said there. The first thing that I notice is that Abraham is not speaking to the rich man with anger. He calls him son. He speaks to him really in love. He tells him the truth in love, and he's not angry. He didn't tell him, well, you had your chance, suffer. I mean, you know what I mean? He didn't respond with this aversive, you got what you deserve, so just sit in your juice and stew in it. He said, son, you had this opportunity in your lifetime to live a certain way. You chose not to, and you were comforted in it. Whereas Lazarus suffered in his life, and now he finds comfort. But I love this analogy. How can he be talking to the rich man when this great chasm exists? On the one hand, this rich man is so far but so near. And he says, and even Lazarus, even the rich man, in his time of anguish, he has no desire to relieve Lazarus. He does not show any mercy to Lazarus still. He wants Lazarus to minister to him. And in his lifetime, he ignored Lazarus. When he was in tremendous anguish and pain and trouble, he ignored him. But even when he's in anguish and pain, the rich man wants Lazarus to come to him and help him. Never understanding that there was a time Lazarus needed him, needed his assistance, needed his help, and never gave any thought to it. And he ignored Lazarus during that time, and even in his anguish, he wants Lazarus to come to him. And that's when Abraham says, well, we can't do it, because there's this great chasm that exists that does not enable us to cross and see you, or for you to come and cross and see us. So how can it be so far and so near at the same time? How can there be the suffering when Abraham is speaking to him in love and telling him son? He's calling him son. So there's a relationship there that he still has with this rich man. And it's very hard to understand. It's a great mystery to understand this gospel reading. And this chasm, what is this chasm that exists? And I think I finally get the sense from this gospel reading that God is not doing anything to the rich man. It's more what the rich man did to himself. And St. Macrina, who's talking to her brother, St. Gregory of Nyssa, has a wonderful word on this regarding this gulf, this chasm that exists. And then she says, this in my opinion is the gulf, which is not an earthly abyss that the judgment between two opposite choices of life creates. Once one has chosen the pleasure of this life and has not remedied its bad choice by change of heart, he produces for himself a place empty of good hereafter. He digs this unavoidable necessity for himself like some deep and trackless pit. So I think if we're going to talk about, and parents, if you're talking to kids about what is hell is really more the consequences of the choices we make in life. You know, and we have these wonderful words from Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. From the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So that very rule will be used against us in our life, for good or for bad. If we spend our life finding fault with others, guess what God's going to do at Judgment Day? He's going to find fault with us. If we spend our lives being kind and compassionate to others, God will be merciful and compassionate to us. And it's not God doing something to us. It's going to be the manner of the choices we make in life that govern where we end up in our relationship with God. And it's not God sending us somewhere. It's a matter of a state of the mind. It's a state of a heart that we bring upon ourselves through how we live in this life. And those words from Matthew I just read to you from chapter 7 are really important words for all of us to remember. You know, the measure you use will be the measure you get. You know, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And that's an important word there. And so keep those words in mind that if you're kind and merciful with people, God will be kind and merciful with you. But if we spend our lives finding fault with others, criticizing others, judging others, then guess what? God's going to find all those things in our life that we've hidden, and he's going to judge us. And you know what? The result of that will be we're going to end up like that rich man. But not because God did something to us, not because he sent us somewhere, but hell is going to be something of our own doing, however we understand that. And that anguish, he was inflamed. Well, it's the anguish of knowing he had the choice to choose love and to choose God, and he rejected that. And that's hell. You stand in the living presence of God, understanding you have love before you, and you lived your life rejecting that love and rather making up your own rules to live by. And so this is an important thing for us to remember. I don't know if any of you have read the Chronicles of Narnia, but The Last Battle is a very good book to read because it describes the Last Judgment. And I can tell you, it's one of the best orthodox things I've written on what the Last Judgment is. And I don't know if you remember, the dwarfs were very cunning parts of Narnia, citizens of Narnia, but they were out for themselves, you know, and their motto was always, the dwarfs are for the dwarfs. And they got so cynical in their views of things, they couldn't even recognize Aslan, who was Jesus in the story, as the savior of them. And there's this one point in the last battle where they're being allowed to see this table, this Eucharistic table, and they can't see it. They just see it as being bad food and slop. And they keep on saying the dwarfs are for the dwarfs. And then Aslan says the following, who's an image of Christ in these stories. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs. You see, said Aslan, they will not let us help them. They have chosen cunning instead of belief. Their prison is only in their own minds, and yet they are in that prison, and so afraid of being taken in, they cannot be taken out. So we can develop mindsets in life about how we live, how we see people. And if that cynicism, like the dwarfs, governs us, guess what? We're going to be in that situation of they're being so afraid of being taken in, they cannot be taken out. Because cynicism breeds mistrust. And then you're out for yourself. Everything's about self-preservation. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs. And so after a while, I'm sure this rich man didn't quite get it. After all those years of ignoring this poor person, Lazarus, who needed mercy, he failed to show him mercy. And even in his death, even in his anguish and pain, he still doesn't get it because he's asking Abraham to come send Lazarus to him to relieve his pain, and he's sending, and then he's saying, send him to my brothers so they won't have to go through what I went through. Then Jesus says if they didn't believe Moses and the prophets, they're not going to believe somebody come from the dead. And that's the reality of life. You know, that's what this example is. When God comes and makes himself known to us, sometimes we just don't plain see him because we're not looking for him. And we've got other things in our mind that we seek and desire to know. And it's like the stubbornness that governs our mind. And so as you begin to talk to your kids about things like heaven and hell, be very careful. You know, I know when somebody dies, somebody says, I know they're in heaven. Well, I hope so, because if I know who's in heaven, that means I know who's in hell. And so that's why we talk about people falling asleep in the hope of the resurrection, because Christ has not come. He has not come in judgment yet. So we believe in the hope of the resurrection, and as Morgan Freeman says in The Shawshank Redemption, hope is a dangerous thing. Because if you have hope, you have the ability to dig out of the hole you put yourself in. And so God help us this day now to really trust in the love of God, the mercy of God, and to believe that anybody who falls asleep goes to the mercy of God, and that's how we should leave it. Because I would never dare to think that I know somebody's in heaven, because that would then mean I would have knowledge of who's in hell. And even those polarities really bother me, because Jesus didn't invite us to join his kingdom to avoid going to hell. He invited us to enter into his kingdom, to follow him, that we would find life and treasure in following him. That's the goal. It's not go follow me or you're going to go to hell. You know, we need to get away from that line of thinking. I think a lot of that comes from growing up in this country. It's a reformed mindset. If you've talked to anybody from other Christian groups, they'll say, do you know if you died today where you would be? Those are questions that we don't ask. The invitation to the gospel is to come follow Jesus. And when people ask Jesus about what it's like, what does he say? He says, come and see. That's all he says. He says you'll have treasure in heaven, but you have to accept that invitation, and nobody can make you accept it. You have to choose it. You have to desire it and hunger for it. And in hungering for that desire to follow Christ, that means you got to let go of something you're hanging on to. Whether it's, I don't know. I mean, there's so many things we hang on to in life that don't allow us to see Christ for who he really is. And that's why we have a life of confession in the church, to help us learn about ourselves, because once we stand close to the light of Christ, how can any of us not but fall on our knees and say, hey, Lord, have mercy upon me, a sinner? Because to stand in the light of Christ is to have everything in your life exposed to what it is. And so, unless we can find joy, and find joy like Peter did in the Gospel of Luke we read about several weeks ago, where when Jesus, through the miracle of catching the fish, the experienced fisherman Peter, who didn't catch anything all night, ran to him and fell to his knees and said, Lord, get away from me, a sinner. But he ran to him. He drew near to him to say, get away from me, a sinner. And somewhere in that issue where he kneeled before Jesus, there had to be some degree of joy in that wanting to draw near to him. He was not afraid of Jesus when he drew near. But what he saw in himself were things in his life that were not right. And he stood in the light of Christ, and that light of Christ made something known to him, maybe that he didn't learn before. And then he runs to him and says, Lord, depart from me, a sinner. So may we, on this day, as we hear the story of the story of Lazarus, now as we're in a few weeks, we're going to be approaching the Advent fast, help us to understand that, anytime you see somebody in need, to turn a cold shoulder is to bring judgment upon ourselves. And so let us find our way to show mercy on those who need mercy and not ignore those who are in need. Because who knows, that may be the Lazarus in our life we're turning away from. Amen.